welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. I had a much different video ready for today. Then I got some news on my news app that said that James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, had died. And I decided this video might be a little more important because this news comes on the heels of Kim Davis asking the Supreme Court to hear her case. And along with them hearing her case would come the consideration of overturning Obergefell v. Hodges, which is the case that provided the recognition of marriage equality across the country, right? So here we are. And if you don't know the tie-in, I'm about to tell you. Because you hear the rhetoric a lot about
save the kids,
protect the family,
defend religious freedom,
stop same-sex marriage.
Like all of these talking points are what he built his entirety of his platform on, and that's not coincidental. So here we are. As you know, in my regular everyday walking around life, I am a relationship therapist for queer couples. I also work with people with religious trauma, and so this intersectionality of this man's life and the recent court case, plus being a queer woman myself in a same-sex relationship, same-sex marriage, this is me. So some historical context. James Dobson founded Focus on the Family in 1977, and that company became the political arm, the money machine, the media empire that really pushed forward the religious rights rhetoric for decades to come. It's a 501c3, which means a not-for-profit organization, gives it a lot of leeway to be involved in lots of different things and not pay any actual penalties for it, because it doesn't have to give shareholders or anybody any information except for it continuing to be a 501c3 not-for-profit, right? It just has to continue to meet the requirements for that status, and then it can essentially do whatever the heck it wants to do. That political arm continued to impact marriage equality and policy through time, like until today and probably beyond, even after he's gone, especially in 2004, 2006, when there was a huge push in the states to make marriage amendments and his pushback against the marriage amendments that happened between 2004 and 2006 on a state level. Core to his identity as a whole, like the things that he really grounded himself in publicly, were his anti-LGBTQIA plus stances. He very much felt like the gaining of rights for the queer community meant the losing of rights for straight cis het men especially, but for straight people and for families as a whole. He couched his entire argument in the idea that queer people having rights meant that straight people would lose, and that was the detriment to straight people for queer people to have rights. Period. Like across the board. And that message, I mean, he really was great at branding, right? Because that message never changed, no matter how the vehicle changed that he was giving it out in, that message never changed. And he tweaked it. He did tweak it because it became really apparent that people stopped buying that message after a while, because in reality, what did it matter to them what another adult was doing? You know, you're looking at the late 70s, right? People didn't really care what other people were doing if it didn't impact them. So enter this idea that gay people are after your kids, because if you threaten people's kids, they are going to push back. If you threaten families, people are going to lose their minds over that. If you convince people their kids are in danger, that will get their attention. It really did. In 1977, another thing was also happening. Anita Bryant was used, her fame in Florida as a singer and as the orange juice queen in Florida was used, and she had national acclaim. She did at that point. All of that was used to push back against the gay rights ordinance that was passed in Miami-Dade. They brought out churches, they brought out the congregants in the churches, they brought out celebrity, they brought out political pundits, they brought out everybody they could and got the ordinance repealed 2-1. That model, using the rhetoric of we're saving the children from these people, right? You don't want them to be seen, you don't want them to be out here in front of everyone because it's bad for the children and they want to warp your children. That was the message. Using that prototype that happened in Miami-Dade, that they were able to really turn everyone's minds around because it had passed with so much approval prior to that messaging. They used that model across the country then, everywhere they possibly could, to start to build fear into people's lives. Fear of gay people as a whole. Anyone within the queer community was now a threat to the family and was now a threat to children. And if you're a threat to children, you are the worst of the worst, right? Like, we've always known that. So obviously, if you're a threat to children, you cannot be given equal rights or equal access to rights, right? So the strategy, does this look familiar? You cast gay people as child-hating and child-manipulating, child-warping, if you will. You bring in celebrity, you bring in church networks, which church and celebrity also, well, they kind of go hand in hand these days, don't they? You bring in political operatives, and the turnout of people who will follow that rhetoric and push it on a political level, vote for those who push that narrative. Those numbers are big. That started in 1977 in Miami-Dade and has continued through a very recent presidential election nationwide. That message turned a little bit into not just they're harming your children, but they're recruiting your children. And this is where the public school gets involved, where this idea that queerness, if it goes unchecked and everyone's given equal rights and seen to be, I don't know, okay and human, that now we're going to see people recruiting kids. And this is the most interesting thing. If you were just to step back and look at this from an anthropological, sociological type lens, it's fascinating to see Christians who push Sunday school, baptism early, grow up in the church, raise them right when they're young and they'll never stray from the path, that kind of teaching. The ones that push that are then saying that this is probably what they're gonna do too. They, being queer people, are gonna do too when their Christians are the ones doing it. It's like a both end, right? They're assuming that everybody's doing it because they're doing it, right? They're saying that they're doing it because they're doing it. And in reality too, they assume this is gonna work because they're doing it. Except it's not working. By the way, it's not working. The numbers of Christianity are down consistently since 1977, but that's, I guess, besides the point. But that's over here's fault, obviously, because they're recruiting over here. But the recruiting methods, if they're being used, should be just as effective over here. Logic escapes me, because we're also talking about how tragic and terrible it is for children to be around gay people because they're going to harm them, when statistically we know that it is more dangerous for a child to be in a church than to be in the company of gay people. So there's that. But we'll continue to ignore that and play smoke and mirrors and point the direction over here and make everyone think that this is the way that it is. Because don't forget that James Dobson was a psychologist, right? He specialized in child psychology prior to opening this whole focus on the family, becoming this voice for the Christian right. And in fact, his opinion on psychology was so strongly understood and accepted and embraced. Focus on the Family started their own ex-gay movement called Love One Out. And that informed the way that evangelical Christian counselors handled people who would come in to talk about same-sex attraction for decades. They would have conventions and people coming together to pray the gay away in these huge stadium settings, not unlike what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago with Shiny Happy People. They would come away saying they were no longer queer. That phenomenon informed the way that Christian counselors, and honestly some secular counselors, saw the ability to change one's sexual orientation for decades, and honestly still kind of does, because this is where this ties into this religious freedom idea. Because you get a little further along in time, you get to 2004 when James Dobson writes a book called Marriage Under Fire, and he talks about how queer people are coming after the nuclear family. They've been at war with the American way of life for so long, and the church and the nuclear family are the only things that stand between the queer agenda and the destruction of American way of life, or the church and the family. And since, gay people are trying to destroy the family, obviously the family has to stay as it is, which also means that you have to oppose same-sex marriage, because the family as it is, the traditional family, which has been this way since time innumerable, which he says in his book, which we'll get to in a second, can't possibly withstand same-sex marriage. Here's the thing, let's talk about that for a minute. 1950s model of family is what they're referring to when they talk about traditional family and traditional family values and stuff, right? In the 1950s, women didn't have the same rights as men. So that is not a goal for families we should be reaching for. It just isn't. Even if you are somebody who still believes, despite the lack of any actual research to back it up, even if you are someone who believes that children need one mother and one father to raise them together, again, despite any real research backing that up, if you're somebody who still believes that, outside of religion, there is not a reason to go back to 1950s nuclear families, because the only people who made out in that bargain were the men. So when we talk about going back to that time, you have to understand that's code for women not having rights too. But this idea of that type of family being the ideal family that has always been the plan in the Bible forever is, again, this very American-centric, Western-oriented view of who God is and who Jesus is, when Jesus was not Western. This Jesus that you worship was not Western, was not white, was not American. None of that was true. And he did not have a 1950s viewpoint of family. He just didn't. That's not how family was in the culture he grew up in. Backing up, if we're looking how Focus on the Family takes this argument through 2004, 2006, through Obergefell, and then changes it into now with this Supreme Court ruling, we're losing religious freedom. And I don't know how many of you heard this in your own churches. I was still working in churches at this point. I heard this from my own boss at the time about how he was worried he was going to be forced to perform same-sex marriages because you weren't going to legally be allowed to say no, which, again, for the record, was never actually going to happen. The idea that the public schools were now being overrun by queer people, and that was an affront to the American family, and schools might be the problem now. So parental rights are more important now, and we have to be giving the parents the rights to determine how their children are raised and how they're morally instructed. Does any of this sound familiar to anybody? Because this was in 2016 that this was being talked about. These things are not new, is what I'm saying to you. These things that are hitting the news now, that have gotten a new bump in our awareness, these are not new. They are the same message repackaged over and over again, constantly causing harm, constantly making people think that they are less than, because this message is everywhere with no stats, no facts to back it up. Because when you really look at it, when you pull apart James Dobson's arguments against marriage equality, when you pull apart Anita Bryant's fame and lessons that she would share, when you pull all of that apart, it's paper thin and melts away. There is no substance to it. There is no reason to believe that two women getting married harms the sanctity of a marriage between a man and a woman, when that same man and woman having 7 marriages between them doesn't harm the sanctity of that marriage. Now the question becomes, what happens really to Focus on the Family? You know, when Pat Robertson died, Jerry Falwell died, when these titans of the conservative Christian movement passed, and they passed before they ever had to answer for anything that they did. Not that it would matter, right? Not that it would change anything, but they left before they had to look at what they did, or ever have to take a glimpse that maybe what they were standing for was harmful or hurting people, or even see that what they were seeing wasn't as widely popular as they thought it was. When people like that die, you do have to wonder what happens to their message. Was it a one-person message? Were there enough people who bought into their lies that it's going to continue? You know, what happens from here? And I don't know. We don't know the answer. Again, there is no actual fact to back up the idea that two men getting married or two women getting married is any kind of an affront to a man and a woman being married. It doesn't remove the rights of two people who are already married for another two people to get married. It's not like there's only 50,000 rights out there and like the first 50,000 people to them get one and no one else gets one. That's not how it works. It's interesting because my argument when we're talking about marriage equality has always been, cool, if you don't want to recognize two women getting married, two men getting married or whatever, why don't you just remove all the 1,100 different rights that are given to people who get married? Just take them away and make marriage just a religious or spiritual entity. Just take that away. And if you wouldn't do that, if you're not okay with that, right, then you are actually trying to block people from having rights. Like that's it. That's the only answer if you are not behind that idea. Which is where I would submit to you, we need to stop using the term same-sex marriage altogether and just call it marriage and say that you're trying to stop people from having rights that you have. It is not new that our rights are being attacked, and it is not new that every time a shift in power happens, we're looking around to see how many of our rights are still going to be there tomorrow. That's not new things, right? It's not fair, and it's not okay, but it's not new. So there you have it. There is the history, the really tangled web of Focus on the Family and their political agenda masked in trying to expose the LGBTQIA plus agenda, which is every accusation is a confession from the far right, honestly. Like, just look at it that way. Every time they make an accusation, know it is a confession on their own game plan. And that's it. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you all next time. And until then, take care of yourselves and each other.